My name's Tom. I'm from New Zealand. I've been working in Australia for the last 10 years, on video games mainly, and sometimes doing some other things for money. Wasn't pleasant, but this is some of the very first research which I did on video games, and it grew out of my very, very strong obsession with Civilization 2, which I had in my youth. Well, when I was 25, 15 years ago, I was really into it. And I think I played it non-stop one whole summer. And I was using this kind of laptop computer that it's got like a little rubbery sponge thing in the keyboard instead of having a mouse. And for some reason, it made me hold my hands in a really funny way. And I got this peculiar pins and needles in my hand. And I lost feeling in my little finger for almost a year. And it didn't stop me from playing Civilization 2. I just thought I should get maybe one of those mice that was external to the laptop. But I'm very fond of this game. And it's the game that kind of got me into thinking about games in a scholarly way. And prior to that, I'd been training as a lawyer, and I'd been doing a minor in film studies. So it really changed how I thought about games and I guess my career path in a pretty serious way. So I'd just like to start off by presenting you with a couple of images. Now, I don't know if should probably explain, I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela, and I'm interested in Venezuela in a kind of general way. But one of the first things I noticed when I went to Venezuela was that there's this province of Venezuela that the Venezuelans think that they have, which is called Guyana or something, which is actually 80% of the country of Guyana. And all maps of Venezuela have this in it as a sovereign part of their country. And it made me think, I guess, about the significance of maps and also the kind of imaginary things that happen in maps. I know, I'm not sure about whether these issues are sensitive or not, but for example, Sweden has some islands in the Gulf of Bothnia that were disputed at some point in time between Sweden and Finland, and it's the only successful League of Nations mandate ever after World War I or something like that. So these kind of historical moments, there's a memory gets attached to them and they become very meaningful, and a trace is left, even though no one in Venezuela is ever going to mobilize into an army and invade their country. It just can't get taken off the way that they do their maps. I guess another way of approaching this that I've been thinking about is from this kind of perspective. Now, apologies for the plastic pieces, but everyone's probably at least aware of this game and the kind of the jerks it can turn people into. I used to play this game a lot when I was a kid. And when you're playing this game with a bunch of friends in a garage in New Zealand, it's a really, really funny experience because you aren't on the map. New Zealand doesn't exist. So you feel like you're some kind of weird Illuminati that's actually like dictating what happens to the world, and they aren't aware that you actually are there playing the game. I mean, obviously, Sweden's probably pretty unhappy about like being lumped in with as one piece, as one space with a bunch of other countries. I'm not sure, but this was always like a big joke for me and my friends when we were playing Risk. So this is a quote from a 20th century Marxist historian, E.H. Carr, who's an extremely famous Anglophone historian. And This is like a sort of a throwaway quote from one of his books on historiography called What is History? And it's a really short book, and it's the kind of book that you are made to read in a first-year history class. 20 years ago, when I used to take those kind of things, probably now you wouldn't be made to do something that was more historiographic. But this kind of idea that people can sit around and have imaginations or think thoughts about how the course of history could have run differently was repugnant to Carr, sort of like who couches it in a very kind of, it's a bourgeois thing to do, you know, like I'm a Marxist, everything goes according to progress. But in the 20th century, the genre of alternative history became a kind of part of popular culture. This kind of speculation about particular events and how fictional scenarios around how the world would have been in particular, say, for example, if the Nazis had won World War II. So you've got like books now which are classic in that genre. I'm thinking of A Man in a High Castle by Philip K. Dick, which is now supposed to be, you know, a highlight of 20th century literature for North America. And a bunch of very respectable authors started to work in this genre, as well as Harry Turtledove. You know. He's not respectable, but, you know, not this kind of literary New York kind of review of books kind of chap. So it started to get an air of literary respectability. And also, more recently, it started to get a kind of academic revitalization through this collection by Niall Ferguson called Virtual History. And of course, this becomes part of gaming culture as well, and which, you know, exemplified in the kind of deeply historical storyline of Assassin's Creed, etc. And the kind of, I guess, positioning of storylines around major diversions from history's pathway. So one of the things that I was interested in is, you know, as playing with history has become more of a everyday possibility, can we dismiss it in this kind of very it's worth nothing way that E.H. Carr does in the middle of the 20th century? So I want to look at this game Europa Universalis, not really because it's the only game that does this, but because it has a particular adherence to an idea of history more than just a kind of abstract process like in Civilization, for example, which would be the other classic text to look at. And look at the ways that it can be used to challenge orthodox and official versions of history. So I'm used to no one at all ever knowing what Europa Universalis is. So I then go into a lengthy description of Europa Universalis, which I won't bore you with. I'm assuming that it's just part of Swedish culture. Everyone just plays it naturally. But you know, it spans 400 years from 1420 to 1820, talking about version 2 here to be specific. And the main focus in that game is the expansion of the European powers to dominate trade and create colonies around the globe. And there's a number of important strategic concerns in the game, and you know, trade, diplomacy, military, etc. And there's a variety of countries that you can choose from initially, which included Sweden. And I never really understood why that was until I realized where Paradox was from and all of that kind of stuff. So the other ones are Poland, Portugal, Russia. So of all of these great empires of the past. But one of the key innovations of the game is that ultimately you can choose any country to play. And this gives the game remarkable flexibility and also requires some imaginative kind of goal setting to make it worthwhile and interesting to play as a country which doesn't have much chance of taking over the globe or even establishing a colony. So appropriate goals and ways to play, suggestions of playing different countries became common fan kind of activities, and they're often hosted on Paradox Interactive's notice boards. So what players do with Europa Universalis provides them with an opportunity to reflect critically on historic events. Opportunity, that is. I mean, it's not necessarily requiring you to do that. A critical level of engagement with the game is encouraged by two drives, which you can see in the online community. And these drives are kind of a bit contradictory. On one hand, there's a desire for increased historic verisimilitude. Those Lithuanian knights should be a little bit faster, people will complain, etc. Their armour should be heavier. You know, that they're basing their argument on some kind of idea of an exterior knowledge of history which they think should be embodied in the game in a more authentic way. And then on the other hand, there's a desire to explore counterfactual imaginings of history, where players try to establish and explore fantastic alternative histories within the game. Through the materials shared by the online community, both of these contradictory drives are able to provide an accessible segue from expert play and deep knowledge of the game to a more technical understanding of the game and its operations and designs. So just to go back to a little bit of the background of how historic games have been discussed, and this is really how Adam and I started a discussion together, is through this distinction which is made between an ideological critique and an informatic critique, which is in Alexander Galloway's book, Gaming Essays on Algorithmic Culture. And it's really very much an extension of an argument he made much earlier in a book called Protocol. So in this sense, he's trying to say, well, I guess it's a software studies move, that there is an output of the game, which you can critique ideologically, but the internal mechanisms of the game, everything which is ideological is rendered as a number, and if you're doing stuff there, it kind of all you're doing is tinkering with an algorithm and thinking that that has some kind of ideological status is, well, difficult. In his, he says, the transcoding of history into specific mathematical models is what is the challenge which is shown by civilization. Modelling historical processes through algorithms means that each ideological factor becomes simply a variable or input within an overarching informatic system. So for him, that's the thing itself which should be getting critiqued, not how a particular country or whatever has been represented, or the processes of history. Past research on Civ has really focused on ideological critiques, and if you've ever played it or any historical video game, there's a lot of stuff to critique about how various things are represented, including sort of ideas about exploration of the world, colonization and development. Europa Universalis allows for quite a wide variety of play, from attempting to complete the game within a total historical accuracy to an exploration of alternative history. But these interrogations of history take place across both the ideological and informatic critiques offered by Galloway, as players both recognise the ideological underpinnings of the game and potentially unpack and modify its coding. So in this lecture, I want to conceptualise the relationship between the two layers, particularly in relation to what I call counterplay. So I'm not really a historian. I'm not a historian at all. I've done a little bit of reading about history and about these issues, and just an overview, and a very simple overview, is that these kind of games plug into a historical paradigm which is a bit unfashionable in terms of presenting history as a story of progress, of teleological progress. And this entered into a European historical discourse through Hegel, Marx and Smith, and has been, I guess, dominant in a way for quite a long time. But with the intervention of more postmodern approaches to history in the last 40, 50 years or so, you get situations like this, where this quote from John Gaddis, where he's just talking about how each factor in history when it happens, each event when it happens, is contingent. And we kind of attribute afterwards a kind of certainty that that was going to happen. So what was contingent in the present seems inevitable in hindsight. In the past, the future was a field of plural possibilities to the subject present in that past. Teleology legitimizes the present as the only possible result of the cumulative events that constitute history, while the future is open to speculation and the consideration of plural possibilities. The past is homogenized by focusing on the chain of events that forges a single path. So, I mean, this image is one of the more provocative ways of, using counterfactual imaginaries to sell alcohol. It's just strange that it turned out to be vodka, but I guess you have to work pretty hard to sell vodka in Mexico. Have to be imaginative. Counterfactual history is a notion that challenges the tendency of the multiple contingencies of the past being homogenized into a singularity in hindsight. Thus, counterfactual history becomes a powerful tool for examining both the past and the present. Counterfactual history examines how multiple potential temporal and spatial trajectories of change can exist simultaneously at different conjunctures. This approach opens up the past to multiple possibilities. The vastness of this multiplicity, however, undermines the scholarly use of the counterfactual. So Carr has this position where it's always wrong. It's just a waste of time. And it's kind of, I wouldn't want to suggest a kind of it's all or nothing, but there are ways which have been intuited which are kind of about, what are the acceptable, rigorous, historic ways of deciding what could be considered as a viable alternative. So we're faced with a kind of problem of declaring nothing to be feasible apart from actual historical events is pretty harsh. And the middle ground, which is suggested by Barney Whorf, is that the real should not simply be equated with the observed. The definition of reality should include not only what is, but what might have been. Then the lines between the real and the might have been become blurred in productive and imaginative ways. Even Ferguson, who's a very right-wingish conservative historian who popularised counterfactual history, limits his inquiry by strictly defining counterfactual history around scenarios which are both plausible and articulated in historical evidence. So that there's some kind of historical evidence shows that there were a number of different ways of thinking about the future at that time. So rather than rejecting counterfactual history as historical, Ferguson and Worf embrace productive positions that acknowledge its usefulness. The strict limits imposed by Ferguson indicate how the counterfactual can be used as a starting point for historical knowledge when it is used to interrogate history. Counterfactuals encourage reflection on what is considered as valid historical evidence and an evaluation of plausibility. By evoking the imaginative dimension of counterfactuals, Worf suggests a broader basis of its interpretive function. Counterfactuals allow people to imagine a different world where strange and unfamiliar mappings and trajectories of time and space have been produced. This allows the what if to challenge deeply held certainties and open up the historical dynamics of power to question. Now, Europa Universalis 2 provides scope for players to articulate and explore their counterfactual imaginary. It does this in two key ways. First, it encourages reflection on historical rigour by providing a platform for dialogue around plausibility. So that there's, in the official notice boards, chat rooms, etc., I always forget what they're called. There's a lot of discussion about what would be realistic in this case. And second, they encourage imaginative approaches to history by permitting and encouraging gameplay that is divergent from strict historical events. So that's just basically by how the game is structured and designed. It encourages counterfactual play and reflection because it deals specifically with the representation of history. The core play of Europa Universalis revolves around a dynamic real-time map which displays the movement of troops, development of infrastructure in towns and provinces, the establishment of trading posts and colonies, and the changing market forces at play. On this map, the players deploy their troops and other commands, producing through conflict and expansion numerous variable counterfactual mappings, while also dealing with the demands of the real historical events for the country which they've chosen to play. Engaging in counterfactual mappings through play creates the opportunity to reimagine the actual event as it involves considering how the event may have otherwise occurred, or indeed what the world would be like if it had not. Through play and counterplay, players may change and transform the paradigm provided by the official version of history. In this respect, the game works to deconstruct teleological paradigms to declare events to be inevitable. More specifically, counterfactuals can undermine the sense of fate that dominant groups adopt to justify their hegemony. In this respect, the counterfactual history provides players with what Manuel Castells calls counterpower, strategies for resisting and potentially challenging institutional power relations. Counterpower, he argues, has been recently enabled by the new technological framework of mass communication, mass self-communication, which is what Manuel Castells calls social media, which allows the public more access to media space. In terms of Europa Universalis 2, players may explore their counterfactual imagination through mastering the game. The more expert the player, the more likely that they will be able to achieve their desired outcome based on skill alone. But on the other hand, as players become more involved in expert play and involved in discussions about expert play, they can start to develop an understanding of the algorithm of the game and what variables to change in order to produce the outcomes that they desire from their algorithm. Their interest in the ideological layer of the game can lead them to an engagement with the algorithmic layer and a new perception of how those layers interrelate. The relationship between available variables and the algorithm is contextualized through the play and replay of the game. It is also recontextualized through the process of counterplay, which I've described elsewhere, but in this context, I'm talking about it as extending play beyond the framework of the game, so that rather than playing the game itself has been played with. These processes are supported by the gaming, blogs, journalism, etc. Collectively, these forums may be described as paratexar communication artifacts pertaining to digital games, that are derived from both official and unofficial sources. Paradox Interactive has extensive forums on their official site, which include many player-authored strategy guides and player-created wikis that aim to break down and examine every aspect of play and counterplay, particularly modding. So now I'm moving on to a couple of examples of what happens on these forums. And these are things that I discovered really long time ago. So they're kind of a bit historical now, I guess, appropriately. So one of the subgenres of paratext which is really fascinating around Europa Universalis and a lot of the other Paradox games is this what's called a after-action report, or an AAR, which is, I guess, a narrative reporting of a session of play, often episodic, like done after each session of play. The after-action report might be updated. And it might be written in a number of different styles. It might be written in a historic style. It might be written in a kind of more a how-to, how I did something kind of style. It might be delivered in more or less the style of a walkthrough, but it often also becomes an elaborate fiction. So this is an example, just a short section of a massive long thread by this guy, Dell19, who's writing a report on a game that he played as Venice. You can see that he pretty much reports the events in the game in a narrative way, without really referring to what he had to do in the game in terms of the practicalities. But other ones would be much more focused on, I sent 2 units to this province, etc. An after-action report acts as a dual display of gaming and writing prowess. In some cases, the posts are illustrated with maps and portraits of historic figures, the historic figures that have been discussed. The AAR may also be used to share the tactics that the writer adopted to succeed. After-action reports often show a remarkable counterfactual imagination, although many illustrate the tension between counterfactual imagination and the desire to adhere to historical verisimilitude by using the AAR as a forum to discuss and justify the plausibility of the scenario which they're postulating. Other reports discuss the pitfalls and difficulties of using the game to recreate historical events accurately. So there's an element of these AARs which are actually reflecting on how well people have recreated historical events. And I guess like well should be maybe in quotation marks. In the paratext found on the official online forums, strategies for counterplay are also shared. In particular, a great deal of effort goes into discussing and evaluating the various strategies and tactics for the many playable factions. But the discussion often continues past the formal limits of the game, expanding into the area of modding the game's code, or at least using the interface provided to change different variables. Some users of these forums turn to algorithmic layers of Europa Universalis 2 in order to have better control over the ideological layer. Their desire to explore their counterfactual imaginary in a way that reflects their predilections leads them to explore the coding of the game itself. Participations in the official online discussion boards often articulate their concerns with both play and modding of Europa Universalis in relation to the notion of historical verisimilitude, often wanting to create more realistic gameplay experiences, or conversely, perceiving realism as an inhibiting factor. Nuanced discussions emerge on topics such as how to alter the game to allow the historic losers to win. So there'll be what would be the best way to change the factors in Europa Universalis to make the Aztecs be able to potentially repel the Spanish without the fight seeming one-sided or realistic. The online forums negotiate the conflicting concerns of those players who wish official history to be strictly adhered to because they actually desire the game to be authentically historical, and those players who regard exploring the historical possibilities presented in the game as a key part of the enjoyment of the game. Players from both camps will discuss and share tactics of play and modding in order to produce and play the experiences that they desire. And an exemplary example of this is this thread here I've got a rather small picture of, which is from 2002. It's a really long, one of the most famous AARs at that time. It's a long thread. It's called Rise of the Condor. And this thread reported on a game where the Incas successfully repelled the Spanish from South America. Now, in the standard version of Europa Universalis 2, it's possible to play as the Incas, or a number of other historically important civilizations. But the game is coded in such a way that it is improbable that they'll be able to win the game or even survive the onslaught of a European expansion. Even a highly skilled expert player playing as the Incas would eventually be defeated because of the sheer inequality of resources and infrastructures between them and the typical European seafaring power. When the coded rules and values of Europa Universalis 2 strongly suggest that despite being more flexible than many other historical strategy games, it still should be played in particular ways. So even though you can play a number of different factions in the game, it doesn't seem like it's going to be really that much fun to play them. In fact, it's inevitable that you'll be defeated. But this process of actually intervening and changing factors within the game allows players to postulate scenarios where a game like that could be fun or more even. So the Rise of the Condor commences with a discussion of how to mod the game to make the Incas more playable, which is done by modifying certain editable text files to change key variables to represent the Incan Empire. The AIR discusses increasing the size of both Incan armies and how to change its economic infrastructure, and importantly, it illustrates how these changes were made. In this case, the counterfactual imagery is tempered by the desire to be as historically accurate as possible, whilst still providing reasonable scope for the player of the Inca faction to consolidate their power and repel the Spanish within the rules of the game. Rise of the Condor demonstrates that the boundaries between play and counterplay are blurred. The easiest segue between play and counterplay is supported by the relative simplicity of the process and the wealth of easily accessible community-created guides that describe it step by step. Guides cover all aspects of modifying Europa Universalis 2 and are made both by individuals and collectives, and there's some quite large collective projects which bring together entire documentations on these games. One of the ones at that time, which was really big, was called the Alternative Grand Campaign and Event Exchange Project, which was a massive project about creating events for every single nation portrayed in the game. So in the original configuration of the game, only the 8 playable main nations had large number of events which represented things that actually happened in that nation's history. So if you're playing as Oman, you wouldn't get any events. And these events were sometimes catastrophic, sometimes good, but they just added a richness to the game that this project wanted to build on. On both the ideological and algorithmic layers, Europa Universalis 2 presents an official history. The game does not question the dominant portrayal of the past, rather it attempts to simulate it. Through play, often an encounter with the online community this simulation can form amusing, unusual, and challenging depictions of history. While seeking both to conform to and challenge official versions of history on the ideological layer, players must understand or try to understand the algorithmic layer. This layer reduces all ideological representation into numerical and text editable values within a larger algorithm. Through playing by the rules, players are not forced to uncritically accept official version of history that has been portrayed. Rather, there are opportunities within the game through counterplay that provide key moments of opportunity for critical reflection. The core critical element of counterfactual play is the focus on feasibility and the possibilities provided by imagining things differently. Desire for historical verisimilitude drives a constant evaluation of feasibility and redesign of the variables built into the game. This push to produce an authentic ideology, while naive, leads to an engagement with the algorithmic layer. The counterfactual imaginary stimulates a similar impulse. Led by the designed counterfactual possibilities, players begin to explore more fantastic scenarios. However, because this takes place within the framework of a game, counterfactuals must also be playable, and to still be a game, therefore, there must be some sense of challenge and balance. Through modding the game, players challenge its authority as a text that represents an official version of history. Through producing a version of history that is in a dialogue between the official version of the game, their own understanding of feasibility and verisimilitude, or their counterfactual imagination, players contribute to an understanding of the past that is plural and contingent. In this sense, the way that Europa Universalis II encourages counterfactual counterplay that contributes to the formation of counterpower by challenging the authority of hegemonic and linear official history.